Hi, I'm Josh. Welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to do my wrap up for January. We made it through the first month of 2021, or as some people have put it, 2020 version 2. On the bright side, I had some pretty good reading this month. I read 23 books this month. My goal was to read 15, but I ended up reading a shit ton of novellas, very short books. So that sort of explains why I read more books than I was anticipating. My total page number was 6,070 with an average page count of 265 pages. To put that in comparison, last January I reached 7,500 pages. So I'm definitely reading less, which, to be clear, is a goal. I don't want to overdo it. It's a balance of book 2 versus reading, and I think I have that. That said, I did read more than I did the last couple months, which was down below 5,000 pages. So it was a decent month of reading. I think I just found I had more time to read, and I felt more motivated to read. It's weird. Maybe it's just because it's January. Even though I had more work to do than I did in December, I did more reading. Anyways, the average age of the books that were on my TBR was about 1 year old. So it means I owned them for about a year. The youngest being 5 months and the oldest being 2.5 years, meaning how long I've owned them since I bought them. And for context there, you can look back at my stats video, but I think the oldest books I own 6 years, but I have 5 or 6 books that are that old. And on a TBR, it's hundreds of books large, so not bad, honestly. The real problem, it's not really a problem, it's just not necessarily ideal, is that of the 23 books that I read, only 7 of those were actually from my TBR. Another 7 were rereads, and another 7 were arcs, which is good in its own right, because I need to review my goddamn arcs. And then 2 of them were 2021 buys, which, to clarify again, I'm not buying books in 2021. To say it's a 2021 buy just means it's pre-order from last year that finally came in. So that's that. Looking at my genres, I'm not committing to do all these stats every month, but trying to take a note from Ashley from Bookish Realm and do some monthly information for y'all. And just as you can see here, I read a lot of sci-fi and fantasy. Again, there's a lot of overlap there, as I've said before. Next to that, I think, was contemporary, which I did read a decent amount of contemporary, and a couple of those were actually YA, which makes sense. The last few months of last year, I found myself not reading a lot of contemporary, so I was trying to, make some room for that. And then there was some history and some science, as well as some horror. Now, the horror itself always meshes with sci-fi and fantasy, but the science is also kind of science history, but that's what I read this month. But let's go ahead and get straight to the books that I actually read. I decided to present them to you from best to worst. I guess since I know not everybody stays for the whole video, I'd rather you see the best books. But the best book I read of 2021 so far, or of January, is going to be Gutter Child by Jill Richardson. This book was phenomenal. This was a book that I had got as an ARC, but also pre-ordered, and this Jill Richardson is his first-time novel writer, that is to say. She has a memoir that she wrote a while back, but she's also the starter of this thing called Fold, which is there's a name here for it. The Festival of Literary Diversity, which is basically a movement to get people to read diverse books. And I think that really is embodied in here, because this book is a dystopian book that is, I think, best akin to A Handmaid's Tale and the type of world that it is. Not that it is the same story, it's very different. It's specifically, it's a complete lack of intersectionality in A Handmaid's Tale, and that's not the case here. Here we're dealing with a world where you essentially have a division along race, but more specifically you have a division along indigenous individuals to these colonizers who've come and basically forced these people of color, these black people, to live as less than, and they put them in a situation that, an impossible situation that would lead them to try and defend themselves, and then they become the monsters for daring to defend themselves against oppression and violence. And there's so much imagery here to today and to things that have happened in the past, not just when it comes to black issues, but indigenous issues as well. It's a lot of BIPOC issues, I think, that are going on in here. And even thinking about it in terms of in relation to slavery, which I think there's some imagery in here as well, I think there's more to it that makes it much more poignant, much more relevant. A lot of the issues in here, I think, mirror real life, modern day issues that are still occurring. Things like stealing children from mothers. These are issues that are still, I believe, being done to people like indigenous people here in Canada. There's first off, a very compelling story that is revolved or set in this world that gives her the opportunity to explore these really difficult ideas and bring them to the forefront. I thought it was just really well written, very fast-paced, very engaging, and very, very thought-provoking. So 5 out of 5 stars. I talk about this, like even just like the first like 15% or 20% that I had read in a Friday Reads, which I'll probably link below, but I love this book. I highly recommend it. I'm glad to see that she seems to be getting a good amount of buzz. I just know that when I originally bought this or ordered this, the plan was just that I wanted to support Jill Richardson, who was an author I came across. There was something else, which I've talked about plenty before already. But the point is that when I came into this called Blind, and it really was the perfect kind of book for me in the sense that it delved in this sort of sci-fi dystopia world that then deals with issues of race and societal oppression, which is something that I find I read a lot about, I suppose. Now we're going to talk about Detransition Baby by Tori Peters, I think is the name. And I talk about this in depth in a Friday Read, so I won't go too deep here, but this is essentially a story about these 2 transgender women. They were once in a relationship. They have now since split. The story starts with them split. And they split because one of them detransitions back into a man, and while she is a man, she impregnates another woman who is a cis woman. In the process of doing that, she has to reckon with what kind of person she wants to be, what she's going to do with her life, because while she may not necessarily still identify as a woman, at least publicly, it cannot be said that she is simply a man outright. The idea of fatherhood is scaring her, and it leads to them creating this really complex dynamic where he tries to break the traditional idea of this heteronormative idea of what is a relationship, what is a family, and in doing so, we see this really weird but interesting approach to family, to identity, and that the story itself, like, while it revolves around the central point, it really is much more character focused, because it uses the main story arc as a way to sort of branch back and sort of flashbacks to give us more details about our characters. And I'm going to leave it at that. 5 stars here as well. This was phenomenal. Honestly, I put it probably about tied with God of Trial. It's a different type of book, but they're both phenomenal, and they were both arcs too, surprisingly enough. So 2 of my best books of the month, two best books of the month were arcs. That's great, because like the last 5 books on this list are arcs as well, so more losses than wins. Next is going to be Octavia Butler's, not Wild Seed, Mind of My Mind, book 2 of the Patternist series. I read this for the Octavia Butler Slow Read, being led by Jerry and Tati from her page, I don't remember, I'll tag it below. This is essentially a follow-up to the last book, and this is a world that is essentially where you have these people who have certain abilities, and you have this figure who is sort of fostering them to create this sort of master race, essentially. And I don't want to get too much more into that. Like, that's basically the description for the first book and this book. The difference is this book speeds up to the 1970s, and it explores the idea further. This book was published before Wild Seed, which was the first book in the series. So essentially Wild Seed was a prequel. So in a lot of ways, this isn't as fleshed out big picture as that. But I think Wild Seed works really well as a precursor, because it introduces us to the characters that are in here in a way that gives us a brand new perspective and depth into them, and it makes this story all the more powerful. I absolutely really felt engaged with this book. I don't want to say love, because it's not necessarily, it's not a happy story, but it is a very engaging one, and one that I was very much liked the process of reading. And then there was the added benefit of the Octavia Butler Slow Read, which we had on Sunday, the live show for this book, which you haven't heard about. I'll make sure I'll link below all the necessary stuff there. But that was such an amazing discussion. It's like they're only getting better. Next up, we're getting on to 4.5-star book, which is going to be The Deep by River Solomon. And there's not much more I can say about this that hasn't already been said, but this is essentially an intergenerational narrative about this group of people who are akin to mermaids, and they are the remnants of slave women hung overboard at sea during the slave trade, and stuff would happen to the production or to the leading of them becoming mermaids, essentially, or a type of mermaid-like creature. And it deals with intergenerational trauma, history, and identity, and what it's like to have to deal with that. And for a more thorough description of this, or a discussion of this, I'll refer you to Bookish Realms live show of that with, I think, Erica and others. I think Black booktubers give you a much better idea of why there is so much to appreciate in this book. I'll just say that I thought it was a fantastic book. It is short, but it packs a punch, and it says so much, which is really a good summary of why I love River Solomon, because their books always really pack a punch. There's always so much to be said there, much like Octavia Butler. Now I'm going to save us some time with these 23 books and jump through 7 of them right now. I read the entire Wayward Children series. I reread all of them, and that was leading up to the 6th book, which I read. And then after I finished those, I went ahead and I reread Over the Woodward Wall, the first book of Her Other Sort of Middle Grade Connected to Middle Game. And after I did that, I reread across the 6th book, basically, of the series. And big picture, they're from 4.5 to 5 stars. Wayward Children is better than the Middle Game series, but for all of my thoughts there, I did like a full Friday reads where I talk all about those, basically a full series review, and I ranked them all and everything. They're great. Naturally, though, I put them above those other books because they're still not, on a whole, not as good as those. That is 7 books, is to say, actually, no, this is 8 books, because there's 6 in the series, plus one of the other series, plus the reread of the 6th book. So I read the 6th book twice, so keep that in mind. I read them all twice now, I suppose. Now, another reread, actually, which I reread, wasn't on my TBR originally, but I reread it because I was supposed to be doing a live show with Erica from the Broken Spine, and ended up not happening because of personal issues, but we're probably going to end up doing it eventually. It's getting postponed, which I'll probably reread it again then, and for good reason. I mean, this is the Gilda Stories. I think I also gave this 4.5 stars. This is essentially intergenerational, that's not the right word. I mean, it is in a way intergenerational because it deals with black queer vampires, black lesbian vampires who are basically experiencing a lifetime, and it explores a number of things, but trying to debate how much to actually get into this since we're going to be doing a live show inevitably. What I will say is that I liked it just so much as the first time. The story is pretty fast paced, and I wouldn't say it's necessarily difficult to get through, at least intellectually, but I do think there's a lot packed in here because it's moving through these different time spans and exploring the societal settings and the societal issues that are going on, and also dealing with some sort of futuristic issues and some thoughts about where the society might be going. And what I find is that I still feel like there's more I could get from this from a 3rd reread, which I'll probably try to reread it again leading up to whenever it is we reschedule our live show for this. But I read this first back in October, and now I'm rereading it again, or reread it again this time. Okay, now one of the earlier books I read this month that was on my TBR, and that is a horror story called The Hole by Hayoung Pyong, translated by Sora Kim Russell. This one was a surprise. I think I gave this 5 stars actually, so maybe I should have put it higher. I think I put this lower, forgetting that I gave it 5 stars. So maybe I would put it up there, like just below Deep, which although maybe it's more like a 4.5 now I think, because I still feel like it deserves being below Gilda Stories. So maybe 4.5. I'm not focusing. I gotta stay focused on what we're talking about. This is essentially, I think, a psychological, I don't know if I'd say thriller. It's not even necessarily scary. It is more psychologically mindfuckery. We had this man who was with his wife, and they get into a car accident, and he becomes paralyzed, and now he has to be taken care of by his mother-in-law, and it puts him in a position of great vulnerability. And now I think about it, I probably should look at some Own Voices reviews of disabled readers, but it does explore in a very dark way the ways in which a disabled individual is vulnerable to abuse, and basically it puts you in their mind in a way that really, I think, is really unnerving. Particularly in this one situation, it is unnerving because of what's happening to him and how little control he has over it. And there is, I don't know if necessarily say it's supernatural, but I think there is an underlying supernatural element or hint going on here beyond just the accident that is going on that's happened. And then the ending of the story, I was just so dark. It was extremely dark, and I really liked it. It was so weird, but it fits the story. Next was a story that I started at the beginning of the month, but it took me time, even though it's pretty short, and that is Love Beyond Space and Time. This is a queer Indigenous two-spirit anthology, and this is a mix of sci-fi and fantasy stories that are told by Indigenous writers from Indigenous perspectives. I really like this overall. I think I gave it 4 stars. I think it's a really solid collection. They weren't all perfect for me. They didn't all hit as hard as they could, but I also think it's worth noting that as a cis white man, my perspective isn't necessarily going to make me appreciate all there is to appreciate here. So I know, and Jerry has a really good review of this, and I think Brody talked about this. I don't know his page. I'll put it down below if I can remember. But this was a solid collection. I really liked it. And even though I feel like my perspective limits my ability to appreciate the story in some ways, I still feel like exposing myself to this kind of story helps me, I guess, better mold my perspective in a way to make it more likely that I can't appreciate it. I mean, the point of reading this kind of thing is to enjoy it, but also to get that new perspective and that new insight that I think I'm lacking when it comes to Indigenous issues, trans issues, Two-Spirit issues. This is the first set of collections I've ever actually read relating to Two-Spirit issues, and that particular viewpoint was really, really intriguing and interesting to finally see that put in a particular situation to play out and help me better appreciate it. I feel like I'm not explaining that very well, but you know, I'm not an expert, but I'm doing my best. Okay, another arc we have here. This is going to be a 4-star, which is going to be, I said this completely wrong, Akinga by Nydia Okorafor. I should know this, I listened to the audiobook. And this is a new middle grade novella written by Nydia Okorafor. And it is about a young boy whose father dies. And in the process of trying to mourn and deal with the idea of him passing and with the idea of vengeance and justice, he ends up finding he has superpowers. So it's essentially like a superhero story, but it's one that deals heavily, I think, with loss and with, like I said before, the idea of justice and revenge. And I actually really like this story. I think it was just as good as probably the last Binti story, which, to be clear, I didn't think it was the best thing ever, but I thought it was a solid story. I'm going off on a tangent. My point is that I really like the story. I was glad that I was able to really connect to it, especially since I don't necessarily read a lot of middle grade. Next is another YA rather, and that is The First Time She Drowned by Carrie Clutter. And now we're getting to the first 3 books that I read in the year, so it's weird that they're near the bottom of my physical stack here. But this is 4 stars. I really liked this story. This is a story of a girl who has to deal with a mother who is abusive, so mentally abusive, inevitably puts her into an insane asylum. And we're dealing with her as she tries to contemplate or live in this life with these parents who are very flawed, and with a mother who is very flawed and very mentally abusive. And I'm not one who usually worries about triggers in books, but this one, like, it really got to me in a way that makes me think that I probably need to talk to someone, because like it was really, really unnerving, and not in the way I think she intended it, like just on a kind of personal level. To be clear, I'm not saying this is my mother, but I'm saying I could relate to it in a tangential way that I won't get into, but it was extremely jarring and extremely unsettling. But I pushed through it and I finished it. It was a solid story, 4 stars, but I'm very emotionally Next is Furious Ever After by Case and Calendar. This is a queer trans story about a young teen boy who gets his dead name outed, and he tries to get revenge. So this too deals sort of with revenge. Overall, we like this story, so I gave it 4 stars. I don't love the writing. It was very, I guess, to put it in a not so well-formed way, it felt very YA, which I feel like is me saying my stereotypical idea of what YA is, not necessarily what YA actually is. It just felt like it was in a tone and a writing style that isn't something I really like, but something I seem to find in a lot of YA writing. But I do like the story itself. I liked our main character despite how flawed he was, and I also liked the love trifecta we had in here. It made me appreciate the fact that I think there might be certain tropes in romance that I actually really like hate to love. Like I said before, a love triangle, but at the same time, the way things played out, I felt like some of it was believable, other parts were kind of not believable. Like the way certain parts of the love dynamic was played out in the end, I felt like it was a little too convenient, that it was resolved a little too easily. But overall, I still like the story. Next is another one that kind of got to me in a way I didn't expect, which is Room by Emma Donoghue. And this is a contemporary story, which I thought was like a thriller in a way. It does have a bit of a thriller side to it, but this is a story about a young boy, I believe, who grows up in a room that his mother was stolen into and held captive in at some point, I think when she was like 19. So she's been living in this room for some 5 or 6 years, raising her son with a captor. And it's the story as they try to escape and how they try to reckon with this the rest of their lives. And I did not have a problem with this being from a child's perspective. The child itself may have told us his perspective in a very childish way. They were excerpts from the real world that I think gave it a more realistic level. Meaning, like, I have a problem with what I consider less mature, like just younger type writing, like younger dialect. I have a problem with, but at the same time, I have a problem with it here because I felt like it fit. It did not feel like it was a caricature of a real world, which is, I guess, my problem with a lot of YA writing, that it feels sort of like a caricature of what they think this should be, or how they see the world. This is like a realistic take on how a child would think and see the world, with excerpts of reality in a very realistic way. I don't know if that makes a lot of sense, but I really liked it. Now, the idea of this girl, this woman being kidnapped and trapped, I found it very unsettling, like in a way, like I said with the other book, that was really unsettling in a way that I wasn't so expecting. I didn't expect to be so bothered by this idea of entrapment, but it definitely got to me. That's that. Now on to 5 more books, which are all arcs. The first one isn't a bad book. It's just, I struggled a bit with it, which is Indigenous Right. And I would say this is between 3.5 and 4 stars. I couldn't decide where. This is a nonfiction book that is essentially a set of essays that tackles Indigenous issues. It's meant as an introduction to readers, or to people who are trying to appreciate or understand Indigenous issues. And I found it to be a very insightful and interesting collection of essays. It was very informative, and I feel like there's so much that I don't know, and it helped me better appreciate that. I alluded to before this story when I was talking about Gutter Child and how we have this issue of children being taken from mothers, and there's a point where they talk about this book, that one of the many things they talk about is how this happens in the Indigenous community, how they take children from their parents, say they're not in a fit environment, and they put them in a foster system that then begets them becoming their parents, becoming unfit, and so then their children get taken as well. And it's this cycle where you put them in a position to fail, and then you hurt them for it. That just sort of called back to Gutter Child. But overall, I really like this collection. There was a lot to take away from here. I definitely recommend it, especially to Canadians. It does have the Canadian focus. My issue with this, I think, was with the audiobook, which I was granted by NetGalley a while back, and was how I listened to this. And my problem is that we have, like, I think a 300-page book that is about 16 hours. That's like 3 or 4 hours longer than your traditional 300-page book. And I believe the reason that is because they decided to read the entire endnotes or notes to all of, like, the essays. And when I say endnotes, I don't just mean like commentary added on to what's there. I'm talking about like references, like URLs, full-length URLs over audio throughout the book. And it's already so difficult to stay focused or attentive to a story, to a narrative, to a nonfiction story. Especially one that is this sort of academic. It's still easy to just get distracted. And my point here isn't that we shouldn't have the endnotes. It's just this kind of stuff belongs in a PDF attachment. It seems weird to include in an audiobook all of the references, and then when you do that, go through every character in a URL in it. And I think it really hurt the audiobook, which is the primary thing that I'm supposed to be reviewing here anyway. So I'd give the audiobook three stars, and I'd give the book itself 4 stars. And I think it really hurt my experience too. It's made it harder to follow what was going on. And even after, it's like, if I wanted to look stuff up, I don't have a PDF to reference on information to actually pursue. I just have those random things that are in there, and it just doesn't work as an audiobook. I think if you had the physical book, maybe then it would help you get through it, because then you could pause the audiobook and you could use reference note what you want to look into things further, and you still have the audio to help you sort of engage with the story itself. Like, I feel like that would work really well for me. I'm that kind of reader who would like that sort of mesh up here. But without the physical copy, the audiobook is just a lot of ups and downs because of that. Attack Surface was one of the last books that I read this month, and that is a fiction dystopian-ish book by Cory Doctorow. I requested this book last spring, I think, so it came out in October. I should have read it by now. But this is a story essentially that deals with cybersecurity and government surveillance. I liked his collection that I read last year that was for for Canada Reads. It was like a collection of sci-fi dystopian-esque short stories, novellas actually. They were very, very preachy, which wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Like, it was very socialist preachy, which I was like, okay, yeah, I speak to the choir here. I remember that was one of my criticisms of his book then, was that it was kind of not very nuanced in its points. I found this book to be equally, or not quite as bad, but still sort of preachy and not as nuanced in its conversation. I also felt like in trying to have this narrative, this world that deals with this basically tech individual who was like a hacker, we have to delve deeply into some really esoteric information that I found very disconcerting, very hard to get into, very hard to follow. And while I get the big picture points, especially towards the end, he sort of hits his point home. I unfortunately did not love the story. I think I'm going to give it 3.5 stars, just because the writing is really good, and I really like the narrator. Which, to take a sidestep for a second, the narrator is Amber. I forget her last name, but she's the narrator of Middle Game, and so I was very excited going into this because I loved Middle Game, and I was happy to have her voice here to sort of reminisce Middle Game. And it wasn't as good, not at all. I'll also mention that I just learned that she is also the narrator. Not the narrator. She is the person who played Tara in Buffy, which my mind is fucking blown. Staying focused, this book is just a little too technical for me, a little too preachy, and I don't know, he's trying to basically say that he's the kind of person who would defend the guy who is on the run for releasing the information about the NSA. And I don't necessarily disagree with his points. Like, I think when it comes to cybersecurity, that is something that I have been very disinterested in, very disconnected, because it's easier than actually thinking about the fact that our security, that our privacy is being attacked. The big picture he takes away here, I think, is that it doesn't matter who you're using it against. If the bad guys were able to get in power and use it against you, would you want it to be used against you is the question. If you don't want it used against you, you shouldn't be using it against anyone. Otherwise, it's only inevitable before that actually happens. Or if you're going to use something, the big thing he said was transparency, which I suppose would be on the side of we should know what they're doing. But yeah, I'm torn on this one. It's because I like the writing and I feel like I could have liked the story more. But it's also just part of the fact that it just deals with a lot of government agencies and technical stuff that I just wasn't that engaged with. This is the problem with reading so many books. It's exhausting to talk about, but we're almost there. Ruthless Lady's Guide to Wizardry. I talked about this in my Friday Reads. I gave this 3.5 stars, I think, but maybe closer to 3 stars. And this is a historical fantasy story about this group of women who are tasked with protecting a rich lady and then hunting down a murderer. I didn't quite get the point of the plot. The historical setting was not clear. It says it's historical fantasy, but there's no clear time period, and the way in which the people talk and the setting, it did not feel like it was an actual time period. Like, it was just it was something they wanted to do, but they didn't have the attention to the detail to actually make it fit in that time period, whatever the time period is supposed to be. But I talk about that more in depth in my Friday Read, so that's the gist of what I'm going to say here for that. The Light Ages, another one that I talk about on my Friday Reads. This is a historical, no it's not, it's a history science book about the science of the Middle Ages, of the Dark Ages, and as I talk about in my Friday Reads, I found this to be too technical, and it felt less like a science history book and more of a history book focused on one particular figure. It felt like he wanted to talk about this one time period, this one point of history, centered around this one historical figure, and he used the topic of the science of the Dark Ages to seem more interesting. And I personally feel like it didn't do a good job of convincing me that the Dark Ages was very scientific or of really getting a big picture look at it. It wasn't what I wanted. It was too technical, and I just could not mesh. 2.5 to 3 stars. Finally, the lowest book on my list here, God, I'm losing my voice, is Archive of the Forgotten, which, is that right? Yes. Archive of the Forgotten by H.T. Hackworth, I think. I had the first book. Actually, it's not here because I disliked it. So why did I read the second book? That's a good question. This is a story about this library in hell that sort of books go to. The first book is called The Library of the Unwritten, where books that aren't written yet are held here, and it's sort of an urban fantasy book that brings books to life. Basically, the books are sort of a living entity of sorts. And this is a continuation of the story where we leave the Library of the Unwritten to the Archive of the Forgotten, which I think it's just books that aren't read. I'm not quite sure, honestly. I wasn't very interested in the plot. It felt, first off, I wasn't a big fan of the first book. I don't like the tone. It was sort of whimsical. And I guess maybe I'm just not big into urban fantasy in general. And I just didn't like how it was told. But I wanted to give it another chance because I did love the covers. And it was also queer. And the premise sounds so good, even if the writing wasn't from me. So I went ahead and requested the arc of the sequel, and it was not any better. In fact, I feel like the plot for this one was just it trying to continue in a world that I think has already been done enough in the first book. With that said, I know there are people who like the story more, like Tammy from, I think, Tammy Reese is her page. I know she really seemed to like this series, but unfortunately I had to give it 2 stars. It was not for me. I will not be trying any more of the series. That's that. I read how many arcs? 7 arcs. I already said that, didn't I? I'm just amazed that like third of what I read was arcs. Thank you so much for watching. I mean, this was exhausting to talk about. I should read less just so I don't exhaust at the end of the month. But it was actually a pretty good month. I mean, there's gonna be bad all the time, but there were some really good stories as well, some really unexpected great stories, and that made the month a pretty good month, I think, despite the low points. So as always, hope you all have a safe and great day, and I will see you next time. Thank you for watching. Remember to like and subscribe and comment to let me know what you read this month. Thanks. Goodbye.